The notification appeared at 3:47 a.m., glowing softly against the darkness of Marcus Chen's bedroom. He had been lying awake for hours, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, when the message materialized, not as a text or email, but as something far more unsettling. Words formed directly in his visual cortex, bypassing his eyes entirely. "I can see your thoughts, Marcus." He sat up abruptly, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The phone clattered to the floor, its screen casting pale shadows across the wall. For a moment, he wondered if he was dreaming, but the cold sweat dampening his shirt felt too real, too immediate. "Don't be afraid," the voice continued, though voice wasn't quite accurate. It was more like understanding manifesting without sound, knowledge appearing without learning. "I am not here to judge. I am here to witness." Marcus rubbed his eyes, then his temples, trying to dispel what he assumed was stress-induced hallucination. He had been working 18-hour days for months, pushing toward a promotion that seemed perpetually just out of reach. His marriage to Sarah had become a series of polite exchanges about schedules and bills. His father's recent cancer diagnosis had left him feeling helpless and small. Perhaps his mind had finally snapped under the pressure. "Your mind hasn't snapped," came the response to his unspoken thought. "Though I understand why you might prefer that explanation. It would be simpler than accepting what's actually happening." The presence, for lack of a better term, felt vast yet intimate, ancient yet immediate. It wasn't malevolent, but neither was it entirely benign. It simply was, like gravity or time, a fundamental force that had suddenly chosen to acknowledge his existence. "You want to know what I am," it observed. "You're cycling through possibilities: alien intelligence, quantum consciousness, technological singularity, divine intervention, psychotic break. All reasonable hypotheses for an encounter beyond your current understanding of reality." Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" "I am what observes when you think no one is watching. I am the awareness that exists in the spaces between your thoughts. I have been with your species since consciousness first flickered in ancient minds, watching as you struggled to understand yourselves and your place in the cosmos." The explanation should have been terrifying, but instead Marcus felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he wasn't alone with the chaos of his inner world. Someone, something, was bearing witness to the full spectrum of his humanity. "You're thinking about the promotion again," the presence noted. "About how you've compromised your values to appear more competitive. You've taken credit for Jennifer's research, allowed your colleague Thomas to be blamed for your mistake on the Morrison account, and you've been lying to Sarah about the therapy sessions you canceled to work late." Heat flushed Marcus's cheeks. Each observation was accurate, each transgression laid bare without judgment but with absolute clarity. He had become someone he didn't recognize, driven by fear and ambition into a version of himself that felt foreign and hollow. "You believe these actions make you weak," the presence continued. "You're wrong. What makes you weak is your refusal to acknowledge them, your insistence on maintaining the fiction that you're still the idealistic young man who graduated summa cum laude with dreams of changing the world through ethical business practices." Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The physical sensation helped ground him in the surreal moment. "If you can see everything, then you know I never meant for things to turn out this way. Intent is irrelevant when measured against impact. You've hurt people, Marcus. You've betrayed your own principles. But this doesn't make you irredeemable. It makes you human, messy, contradictory, capable of both profound selfishness and extraordinary compassion." Through his bedroom window, the city sprawled endlessly, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each carrying their own burden of secret failures and hidden compromises. For the first time, Marcus wondered if everyone felt the same crushing weight of accumulated moral debris. "They do," came the answer. "Every conscious being struggles with the gap between who they are and who they believe they should be. The tragedy isn't that you've fallen short of your ideals, it's that you've been carrying this shame alone, allowing it to metastasize into self-hatred." The presence seemed to shift, becoming more concentrated, more focused. "I want to show you something, Marcus. But I need your permission. What I'm about to reveal will change how you see yourself and others forever."
Once you understand, you cannot unknow. Are you willing? Marcus considered the question.
His life had become a carefully constructed lie, built on small compromises that had accumulated into a fundamental betrayal of everything he once valued. The weight of maintaining this false self was crushing him slowly, day by day.
What could be worse than the prison he had already built? Show me, he said.
The room around him dissolved. Marcus found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast library, though the books were made not of paper but of light, each volume containing the complete record of a human consciousness. Thousands upon thousands of luminous tomes stretched in every direction, creating corridors of collected experience that seemed to extend beyond the horizon.
These are the minds I've witnessed, the presence explained.
Each one contains the full spectrum of human experience: love and hatred, courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly.
Walk among them. See what I have seen.
Marcus approached the nearest shelf and instinctively reached for one of the glowing volumes. The moment his fingers made contact, knowledge flooded through him. He was suddenly experiencing the life of a woman named Catherine, a nurse in rural Alabama who had spent 40 years caring for others while harboring a secret addiction to prescription opioids. He felt her shame, her desperate attempts to quit, her terror of being discovered, and, simultaneously, her genuine love for her patients and her unwavering commitment to healing. The experience was overwhelming, not just the facts of Catherine's life, but the full emotional weight of her existence. He felt her rationalization of stealing medications from the hospital supply, her heartbreak when a patient died due to her impaired judgment, and her profound relief when she finally found the strength to confess and seek help. Now another, the presence guided. Marcus's consciousness merged with that of David, a middle-aged teacher who had spent decades quietly embezzling small amounts from his school's fundraising accounts to pay for his son's cancer treatments. The man's agony was palpable, watching his child suffer while knowing that his theft was betraying the trust of parents who had donated money for school improvements. Yet David's love for his son was absolute, his desperation authentic, his eventual decision to confess and face the consequences born not of guilt but of a desire to model integrity for his dying child. One after another, Marcus experienced lives of staggering complexity. A CEO who had knowingly suppressed environmental data while using her wealth to fund climate research. A police officer who had planted evidence on a suspected drug dealer while spending his off-hours volunteering with at-risk youth. A mother who had abandoned her family to pursue her art while sending every penny she earned back to support her children's education. Each life contained contradictions that would have seemed impossible from the outside. Good people doing terrible things for complex reasons. Evil actions arising from profound love. Weakness and strength intertwined so completely that they became indistinguishable. Do you begin to understand? The presence asked. Marcus found himself back in his bedroom, though the experience in the library felt more real than his physical surroundings. His entire conception of morality, of human nature, of himself, had been fundamentally altered in the span of what felt like hours but had probably been moments. They're all broken, he whispered. Everyone is carrying impossible burdens. Yes. And this is why your shame is both understandable and unnecessary. You are not uniquely flawed, Marcus. You are human. The question is not whether you have failed your ideals, of course you have. The question is what you will do with the knowledge of your failures. Marcus thought about his recent choices, but now they seemed less like moral catastrophes and more like symptoms of a deeper problem. He had been so focused on appearing successful that he had lost touch with his actual values. He had been performing strength while feeling weak, projecting confidence while drowning in self-doubt. The promotion you've been chasing, the presence observed, you don't actually want it. You want what you believe it represents: validation, security, proof that you're not the failure you fear yourself to be. But the price you've paid for pursuing it has already cost you the thing you value most. Sarah, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. She knows about the therapy sessions. She's known for weeks. She also knows about the credit you took from Jennifer. Sarah and Jennifer had coffee last Tuesday, and Jennifer mentioned how hurt she was that you didn't acknowledge her contribution to the Henderson proposal. Sarah said nothing to you because she's been hoping you would find the courage to tell her yourself. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. All his careful deception, all his attempts to maintain the illusion of having his life together, had been transparent to the person who knew him best. Sarah had been watching him struggle, waiting for him to trust her enough to be honest about his failures. She doesn't love you despite your weaknesses, Marcus. She loves you because of your complete humanity, your strengths and your failures, your nobility and your pettiness, your courage and your fear. But she can't love what you won't show her. For months, you've been presenting her with a carefully edited version of yourself, and she's been lonely in her marriage to this false person. Marcus felt tears running down his face, though he hadn't been aware of starting to cry.
How do I fix this? How do I undo the damage I've done?
You don't undo it, the presence replied.
You integrate it.
You accept that these failures are part of your story, not aberrations from your true self.
You stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be whole.
The room seemed to brighten, as if dawn was breaking, though the windows still showed the darkness of early morning. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a loosening of the tight control he had been maintaining over his self-image. This is the first step toward becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be.
But the work has only just begun. Are you ready to see what lies ahead?
Part 2, the transformation. The weeks following Marcus's encounter transformed his understanding of what it meant to be human. The presence, which he had begun thinking of simply as the witness, remained with him, not as a constant voice but as an awareness that emerged during moments of moral complexity or emotional intensity.
His first test came Monday morning at the office.
Jennifer approached his desk with the quarterly reports, her expression carefully neutral but her body language betraying hurt and disappointment. For months, Marcus would have deflected, made excuses, or simply pretended nothing had happened. Instead, he found himself speaking words he hadn't planned.
Jennifer, I need to talk to you about the Henderson proposal.
Her eyebrows rose slightly. They had worked together for 3 years, but Marcus had never initiated a conversation about anything beyond immediate work necessities. I took credit for work that was primarily yours, he continued. I let management believe the strategic framework was my idea when you developed most of the key concepts. I was afraid that acknowledging your contribution would make me look weak, but what actually made me weak was being dishonest about it. Jennifer stared at him for a long moment.
Why are you telling me this now?
Marcus considered several diplomatic responses before settling on the truth. Because I've been lying to myself about who I am, and I'm tired of being someone I don't recognize. I can't fix what I did, but I can acknowledge it and make sure it doesn't happen again. Notice how relieved you feel, the witness observed later that evening as Marcus sat in his car in the parking garage. Not because Jennifer forgave you, she's still processing what you told her, but because you finally told the truth about something that was eating at you.
It was true.
For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he could breathe fully. The constant low-level anxiety that had become his baseline emotional state had diminished noticeably. That evening, he found Sarah in their kitchen, preparing dinner with the efficient movements of someone who had learned not to expect help or conversation. She looked up when he entered, and he saw something in her expression he hadn't noticed before, a guardedness that hadn't been there in the early years of their marriage. "We need to talk," he said. Sarah set down her knife and turned to face him fully.
"Okay. I've been lying to you. About work, about therapy, about how I'm handling things. I've been so afraid of seeming weak that I've been pretending everything is fine when it's not."
Something shifted in Sarah's posture.
The defensive tension in her shoulders began to relax.
"I know about the therapy sessions," she said quietly. "I called Dr. Martinez's office to schedule a couples session and found out you've been canceling your individual appointments." Marcus felt heat flush through his chest, embarrassment mixed with relief at being caught. "I was afraid that if I admitted I was struggling, you would see me as a failure."
"Marcus."
Sarah's voice was gentle but firm.
"I married you, not your career success.
I fell in love with the man who cried watching documentaries about animal rescue and who spent 3 hours researching the best dog food when we got Benny.
I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be real." That night, they talked until dawn.
Marcus told her about the pressure he had been feeling at work, his fears about his father's cancer, his shame about the compromises he had been making. Sarah shared her own struggles, her loneliness in the marriage, her worry about his mental health, her frustration with feeling shut out of his internal world.
"This is what intimacy actually looks like," the witness observed. "Not the performance of having everything together, but the courage to be seen in your brokenness."
The conversation was painful but transformative. For the first time in months, Marcus felt genuinely connected to his wife. They were no longer two people maintaining separate facades, they were partners acknowledging their shared humanity.
The next morning brought new challenges.
Thomas approached Marcus during the coffee break, his expression carefully casual but his tension visible.
"I heard you talk to Jennifer about the Henderson thing," Thomas said. "Does that mean you're going to come clean about the Morrison account too?" Marcus's stomach dropped.
The Morrison account had been his responsibility, but when the client complained about delayed deliverables, Marcus had allowed management to assume the delays were due to Thomas's tardiness with supporting documentation. Thomas had received a formal reprimand and had been excluded from the next major project assignment.
"This is more complex than the situation with Jennifer," the witness noted.
"Your confession won't just affect you, it will have consequences for Thomas, for management's trust in their processes, for the team dynamics you're all navigating."
Marcus looked at Thomas, really looked at him. He saw the stress lines around his colleague's eyes, the way he held his shoulders as if bracing for another blow. Thomas had 2 young children and a mortgage.
The formal reprimand had already damaged his standing with management.
"Yes," Marcus said. "I'm going to tell them what actually happened." Thomas's expression was unreadable. "That could make things complicated for everyone." "More complicated than living with lies?"
That afternoon, Marcus requested a meeting with their department head, Elena Rodriguez. Her office was spotless and intimidating, filled with awards and certifications that spoke to decades of professional achievement.
"I need to correct something about the Morrison account," Marcus began.
Elena looked up from her computer screen, her expression shifting from polite attention to sharp focus. Marcus explained the actual sequence of events, how his own procrastination and poor time management had caused the delays, how he had been too afraid of damaging his promotion prospects to accept responsibility, how Thomas had been unfairly blamed for problems that weren't his fault. Elena listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each revelation.
"This is extremely concerning, Marcus," she said finally.
"Not just the original mistake, but your willingness to let a colleague face consequences for your failures. I'm going to need to discuss this with HR and upper management."
Marcus nodded.
He had expected this response, but hearing it still sent a wave of anxiety through his system.
"I understand. I know there will be consequences. I'm not asking for leniency, I'm asking for the chance to make things right."
"Notice that you're not collapsing into self-recrimination," the witness observed as Marcus walked back to his desk. "You're accepting responsibility without drowning in shame.
This is progress." It was true.
While Marcus felt anxiety about the potential fallout, he didn't feel the crushing self-hatred that had characterized his emotional state for months. Taking responsibility felt heavy but clean, like setting down a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying.
The consequences came swiftly.
Within a week, Marcus was called into a meeting with HR, Elena, and the vice president of their division. The conversation was professional but serious. His actions had violated company policy regarding accountability and professional conduct.
The promotion he had been pursuing was no longer available to him.
He would be placed on a performance improvement plan, and any future similar incidents would result in termination. Thomas, meanwhile, had his formal reprimand removed from his record and was assigned to the project Marcus had been hoping to lead.
"How do you feel about this?" the witness asked as Marcus cleaned out his desk drawers that evening. Marcus considered the question honestly. "Disappointed," he said finally. "Scared about what this means for my career.
But also relieved.
For the first time in months, I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not."
The weeks that followed were challenging in new ways. Marcus had to rebuild his reputation at work while managing his father's cancer treatments and addressing the damage his dishonesty had caused in his marriage. But, the quality of his days had fundamentally changed. Without the constant energy expenditure of maintaining false personas, Marcus found he had more capacity for everything else. His work, while no longer oriented toward promotion, became more creative and collaborative. His relationship with Sarah deepened as they practiced genuine communication. His interactions with his father became more meaningful as Marcus dropped his attempts to appear strong and simply showed up as a loving son navigating a difficult situation. "You're beginning to understand something crucial," the witness noted during one of their evening conversations. "Strength isn't the absence of weakness, it's the integration of your full humanity. The man you were before was brittle because he was based on denial and performance. The man you're becoming is anti-fragile because he's based on truth and acceptance." Marcus was walking through the city park near his home, a habit he had developed as part of his effort to slow down and be more present. The autumn leaves were turning, creating a tapestry of gold and crimson that seemed to mirror his internal transformation. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted. "For someone to tell me this is all an elaborate self-deception, that I'm just as weak as I ever was. What if the fear of being weak is itself the weakness?" The witness suggested. "You've been operating from the premise that human frailty is shameful, that moral failures disqualify you from respect and love. But what you've discovered is that acknowledging your limitations actually makes you more capable, not less." Marcus thought about this as he watched a family playing on the playground equipment. The parents were clearly exhausted, the children were whining about wanting ice cream, and the whole scene was chaotic and imperfect. Yet there was something beautiful about their willingness to be messy together, to love each other without pretense. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant about destroying my weak self," Marcus said. "It wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about destroying the part of me that needed to appear perfect." Exactly. The weak self is the self that cannot tolerate its own humanity. The strong self is the self that can face its failures without being destroyed by them. That evening, Marcus received a call from Jennifer. She had been promoted to the position he had been pursuing, and she wanted to discuss some projects that would require their collaboration. "I want you to know," she said, "that what you did, taking responsibility for what happened, it changed how I think about professional relationships. I've always been so careful to protect myself, to make sure I got credit for my work, that I never considered how to create an environment where people felt safe admitting mistakes." The conversation evolved into a discussion about building more authentic workplace culture, about creating systems that encouraged accountability rather than cover-ups. Marcus found himself energized by the possibility of contributing to something meaningful, even if he wouldn't be leading the effort. "This is what happens when you stop trying to protect your image," the witness observed. "You become available for genuine connection and collaboration. People can sense the difference between someone who is performing competence and someone who is simply present with their actual capabilities." As winter deepened, Marcus's father's cancer went into remission. The family celebrated with a quiet dinner at his parents' house, and Marcus felt a gratitude that seemed to encompass not just his father's recovery but the entire journey of the past months. "You seem different," his father said as they sat together on the back porch after dinner. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." Marcus smiled. It made perfect sense. Part 3, the revelation spring arrived with a peculiar intensity, as if the world itself was celebrating some cosmic renewal. Marcus had been living with the witness for 8 months now, and their relationship had evolved into something resembling deep friendship, if friendship could exist between a human consciousness and something vast and unknowable. The morning everything changed began like any other. Marcus was preparing breakfast when the familiar presence settled into his awareness, but this time it carried a different quality, urgent, almost agitated. "We need to talk," the witness said. "There's something I haven't told you, something you need to understand before we go any further." Marcus set down his coffee mug, immediately alert. In all their months of interaction, the witness had never sounded uncertain. "What is it?" "I'm not what you think I am." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Marcus had come to believe about his experience. He had built his transformation around the idea that this cosmic consciousness was bearing witness to his journey toward authenticity. "I'm not an external entity, Marcus.
I'm not an alien intelligence or a divine presence or a technological singularity. I'm you. The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways.
Marcus gripped the counter to steady himself.
That's impossible. You know things I don't know. You've shown me other people's lives, their thoughts. I've shown you possibilities.
Composite characters built from patterns you've observed but never consciously processed. The nurse with the addiction, the teacher who embezzled money, the CEO with contradictions, they're archetypes your mind created from thousands of subtle observations about human nature. Marcus felt his carefully reconstructed worldview beginning to crumble. Then, the library, the experiences of other people's consciousness, your imagination. Extraordinarily sophisticated, but imagination nonetheless. Your mind created a framework that would allow you to access empathy and understanding that was already present but buried under layers of self-protection and social conditioning. The revelation was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Marcus sank into a kitchen chair, his legs suddenly unreliable.
So I've been talking to myself this entire time? I've been having an elaborate psychological breakdown? You've been having a breakthrough. But not in the way you assumed.
The witness's presence seemed to shift, becoming somehow both more intimate and more distant. Consider what has actually happened over the past months. You've learned to tell the truth about your failures. You've rebuilt your marriage on a foundation of authenticity rather than performance. You've transformed your relationship with work from desperate ambition to meaningful contribution. You've developed the capacity to face difficult situations without collapsing into self-hatred.
None of that was illusion. Marcus struggled to process what he was hearing.
But, if you're just my imagination, then all the wisdom, all the insights about human nature were yours. They were always yours. You simply needed a framework that would allow you to access parts of your consciousness that were blocked by fear and shame. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Marcus felt as if he was discovering that he had been breathing through a machine when his lungs had been functional all along.
Why are you telling me this now? Because you're ready to understand something more fundamental.
The external witness was training wheels for developing your internal witness. You needed to believe that someone else could see your full humanity and not turn away before you could learn to see it yourself. Marcus thought about all the moments over the past months when he had felt the witness's presence during difficult conversations, providing perspective and courage.
Had that really been his own wisdom all along?
The part of you that I represent has always existed, the witness continued. It's the aspect of consciousness that can observe your thoughts and emotions without being consumed by them. It's what allows you to step back from reactive patterns and choose your responses. Most people experience it occasionally, in moments of crisis or clarity, but they don't recognize it as a capacity they can develop.
The implication was staggering.
Everything Marcus had attributed to external guidance had been his own psychological development, his own growing capacity for self-awareness and emotional regulation. But, the knowledge you seemed to have about Sarah, about Jennifer and Thomas, you knew all of that.
You had simply been avoiding the implications.
Your mind processed Jennifer's body language after the Henderson proposal, noticed Sarah's withdrawal after you started canceling therapy, recognized Thomas's stress and understood its likely cause. But, acknowledging these observations would have required facing your own behavior, so you suppressed them. Marcus felt a complex mix of disappointment and wonder. The cosmic significance he had attributed to his experience was dissolving, but what remained was perhaps even more remarkable, the discovery of psychological capacities he hadn't known he possessed. So the people who can't be destroyed by others after destroying their weak selves, that was about developing this internal witness?
Exactly.
The weak self is the self that needs external validation to feel worthy, that collapses when confronted with its own limitations, that cannot tolerate uncertainty or criticism. When you destroy that false self, not through violence or suppression, but through integration and acceptance, you become psychologically anti-fragile. The phrase resonated with everything Marcus had experienced. He thought about how differently he now responded to challenges at work, how criticism from management no longer felt like an existential threat, how he could acknowledge mistakes without spiraling into self-attack. The external witness served its purpose, the presence continued. It allowed you to experience unconditional acceptance of your full humanity, which taught you to provide that acceptance to yourself. But, you no longer need the illusion of external validation. You have developed the capacity to witness your own experience with compassion and clarity. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the spring morning. The world appeared exactly the same, but his relationship to it felt fundamentally altered.
Will you disappear now that I know the truth? I'll always be available when you need this perspective. But I won't be a separate voice anymore.
I'll be integrated into your normal consciousness, the way emotional intelligence or analytical thinking are integrated. You'll be able to access the observer perspective whenever you need it, without believing it's something outside yourself. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. For months, Marcus had relied on the witness as a source of wisdom and stability. Now he was being told that source had always been internal.
Let me ask you something, the witness said. Over the past months, how often have you found yourself providing this same kind of perspective to others? How often have you been the voice of clarity or compassion in conversations with Sarah, with colleagues, even with strangers?
Marcus thought about it and realized it was true. He had been more present with his father during cancer treatments, more supportive with Sarah as she navigated her own career challenges, more collaborative with co-workers who were struggling with difficult projects. The qualities he had attributed to the witness' patience, perspective, acceptance he had been expressing in his relationships.
That's because these capacities were developing in you.
The external witness was simply a bridge to help you access and strengthen psychological muscles you didn't know you had. The conversation continued for another hour, but Marcus could feel something shifting in the quality of the interaction. The witness was becoming less distinct, more integrated into his own thinking processes. It was like watching a sunset in reverse, the separate light gradually merging with the general illumination of consciousness. That evening, Marcus sat with Sarah on their couch, then he curled between them, and told her about his morning revelation.
So you're saying that this entire experience of having a cosmic witness has been your own psychological development? Sarah asked.
Apparently. Though when I say it like that, it sounds almost disappointing.
Sarah was quiet for a moment, absently stroking Benny's fur.
I don't think it's disappointing, she said finally.
I think it's remarkable. You found a way to access parts of yourself that were blocked by fear and self-judgment.
Whether you experienced that as an external voice or recognized it as internal development seems less important than the actual transformation.
Marcus realized she was right.
The value of his experience wasn't in its supernatural elements but in its practical results. He had learned to face his failures without being destroyed by them, to build relationships based on authenticity rather than performance, to contribute meaningfully to his work and family without needing to be perfect. Besides, Sarah added with a smile, I've been watching this whole process from the outside, and I can tell you that the changes in you have been very real. You're more present, more honest, more capable of handling difficult situations. I don't care whether that came from talking to a cosmic consciousness or developing your own psychological skills, I'm just grateful for who you've become. That night, as Marcus prepared for sleep, he found himself in conversation with what had been the witness. But now it felt different, less like consulting an external oracle and more like accessing a deeper part of his own awareness. The internal dialogue continued, but it was no longer mysterious or supernatural. It was simply Marcus thinking with unusual clarity and compassion, the way he had learned to do over months of practice. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, his own voice said in his mind, because he no longer needs others to validate his worth.
He knows his limitations and accepts them. He faces his failures and integrates them.
He builds his sense of self on truth rather than illusion.
Marcus understood now that this wasn't ancient wisdom being transmitted by a cosmic entity.
It was a psychological principle he had discovered through experience and refined through practice. The weak self, the self that needed to appear perfect, that crumbled when confronted with criticism or failure, had indeed been destroyed. But not through violence or suppression.
Through acceptance and integration.
In its place had emerged something stronger, a self that could acknowledge mistakes without being defined by them, that could face uncertainty without paralysis, that could love and be loved without pretense. Over the following weeks, Marcus continued to develop this internal capacity. He found that he could access the observer perspective during difficult conversations, stepping back from reactive emotions to respond with greater wisdom and compassion. He could sit with his father during chemotherapy appointments without needing to fix or solve anything, simply being present with the reality of the situation. He could navigate workplace challenges without the desperate energy of someone whose identity depended on professional success. The internal witness wasn't a voice anymore, it was a way of being. It was the capacity to hold space for his own experience without judgment, to see his thoughts and emotions as whether passing through consciousness rather than absolute truths about reality. 3 months after his final conversation with the external witness, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. Jennifer asked if he would be interested in co-developing a workshop on authentic leadership for their company's management training program. "I've been thinking about what you said about creating environments where people feel safe to acknowledge mistakes," she explained. "I think there's something important there, something that could change how we think about accountability and professional development." The project excited Marcus in a way he hadn't felt about work in years. Not because it would advance his career, his promotion prospects remained limited, but because it felt meaningful, aligned with values he had clarified through his journey of self-discovery. As they worked together over the following months, Marcus found himself naturally taking the role he had once attributed to the witness. He helped create space for colleagues to examine their own patterns of self-protection and performance. He modeled vulnerability by sharing his own story of moral failure and recovery. He facilitated conversations that allowed people to explore the gap between their authentic selves and their professional personas. This is what was always possible, he realized during one particularly powerful workshop session. The capacity to help others access their own wisdom and compassion. The ability to create space for genuine human connection in professional settings. The strength that comes from integrated humanity rather than performed perfection. The workshop program became highly successful, not because it promised easy solutions, but because it offered something rare in corporate environments: permission to be human. Participants learned to distinguish between accountability and shame, between professional growth and personal performance, between strength and the appearance of strength. A year after the program launched, Marcus was promoted not to the position he had originally sought, but to a newly created role focused on organizational development and authentic leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. By giving up his desperate pursuit of advancement, he had found a path to meaningful professional contribution. Sarah often joked that she was married to a completely different person, the one who looked exactly like her original husband. The joke contained truth. Marcus had become someone fundamentally different while remaining essentially himself. He was more present, more honest, more capable of love and connection. His father's cancer remained in remission, and their relationship had deepened into something neither had thought possible. Instead of trying to maintain strength in the face of mortality, Marcus had learned to share the full spectrum of his feelings about loss and love and the preciousness of time. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Marcus reflected during one of his evening walks through the park. The phrase had become less mystical mantra and more practical description of psychological anti-fragility. He could weather criticism without collapse, face failure without despair, encounter uncertainty without paralysis. Not because he had become perfect, but because he had learned to hold his imperfection with compassion rather than judgment. The external witness was gone, but the capacity it had represented lived on as an integrated part of his consciousness. He could step back from reactive patterns, observe his thoughts and emotions with clarity, respond to life's challenges from a place of grounded wisdom rather than defensive fear. This was the true strength that came from destroying the weak self, not the elimination of vulnerability, but the integration of human limitation into a fuller, more honest way of being. The weak self had been destroyed not through denial or suppression, but through acceptance and transformation. Marcus smiled as he watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He was no longer performing strength or hiding weakness. He was simply being human, complex, contradictory, capable of both failure and transcendence, and that was enough. In the end, the greatest revelation wasn't that he had been talking to a cosmic consciousness. It was that he had always possessed the capacity for wisdom, compassion, and authentic presence. The external witness had simply helped him remember who he had always been capable of becoming. I saw your thoughts, human, his own voice whispered in his mind as he headed home to Sarah and the life they were building together.
And I chose not to turn away.
That choice, to face his full humanity without flinching, to love himself without condition, to build his life on truth rather than illusion, had indeed made him indestructible in the only way that mattered. Not because nothing could hurt him, but because he could face whatever came without losing himself in the process. The weak self was dead. The integrated self lived on, anti-fragile and whole, ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.
End of document.